back here after the lunch and ready to take part in the third discussion panel today. I have to say that I really like the complexity of the issues that we've been discussing today, starting from the changing models of EU humanitarian aid, then moving to innovations in development assistance. And now we are shifting to another very up-to-date and interesting topic, which is the changing role of civil society and Central and East European countries. That will be the topic of the next 1 hour approximately of the discussion that will be hosted by my respected colleague Pavel Demes from the German Marshall Fund. Pavel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva. It's my distinct pleasure that I'm having a chance to moderate this post-lunch session, which is always the biggest challenge because each of us would like to have a nap. And we are still waiting for a member of European Parliament who is somewhere in the universe, but I will introduce her when she comes. Even if I'm introduced as German Marshall Fund, I'm non-resident fellow with this organization, but I have something to do for those of you who are not from Slovakia. I used to work at this place. I used to be foreign minister. But my main passion for decades is civil society, so I have my civil society hat also. I am executive committee member of European Endowment for Democracy for 9 years, through which I am in touch with Eastern Partnership countries throughout almost a decade. So that is why I am particularly happy that with this panel we will be zooming in to most dilemmatic part of Europe, nowadays called Eastern Partnership. Before that we said that most dilemmatic is Western Balkans. Now it's rather peaceful part of Europe in comparison with what's going on in Eastern Partnership. This panel is supposed to look at new paradigms and old ways, CEE ODA in the Eastern Partnership and the role of civil society. Topic is quite broad, and I was talking to panelists before in order to make as much as possible out of this panel and link it to broader issues which we discussed in first two panels. First one was most political, be it EU and Slovak approach towards developmental assistance, and second looked at innovations in broader sense and narrower sense. And I think that now we will try to look more at geographically defined region, Eastern Partnership, and particularly within Eastern Partnership, even if we cannot escape Ukrainian crisis or Russia-Ukraine war, we will be predominantly dealing with examples, experiences from Georgia and Moldova, because organizers invited also people who have deep experience, particularly with these two countries. Let me introduce the panelists. To me is Archil Gegeshidze, who is a retired ambassador of Georgia to the United States, but now he's director of the Levan Mikeladze Foundation in Georgia. And so it means that Archil is bringing wealth of experience both from diplomatic and the United States context, but since he is directing this foundation named after Levan Mikeladze, who was a well-known Georgian diplomat who passed away a couple of years ago, he is knowledgeable enough to see both governmental and non-governmental side. Next to him is Raimund Magis, who is Director of Department for Development Cooperation Strategy and Evaluation from Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Austria. Raimund is governmental worker, but knowledgeable about all issues what we have been discussing today. And good thing what I learned from him is that he served for 4 years at External Action Service in Brussels, so he knows a lot about machinery of European approach towards topics what we are going to discuss. So he will be able to tell us not only from his Austrian perspective, but also EU perspective, which I think is very valuable for this. And Evžen DIVIŠ is regional manager for a group of countries which I never seen such a complex group: Mongolia, Georgia, Moldova, and Middle East. Czech Caritas, big NGO, decided to create this type of group, which has I haven't seen, because you have all kinds of Visegrad group, Slavko group, or that group, or B9 group, but Evžen is representing these countries, but for the sake of this discussion, Moldova and Georgia are part of his portfolio. And I learned from Evžen, he is from such a huge NGO. They have about 60 people, staff in Prague, and about 200 all over the world where they are serving. So Evžen is bringing wealth of experience from Caritas, or Catholic Charity, which has offices all over, but Slovak one is much smaller than Czech Caritas. And when Miriam comes, I will introduce her, because otherwise she will think that I didn't introduce her properly. But before that, I will be showing my dissatisfaction that she is coming late. With this, I would like to ask first Raimund. We are discussing about a group called Eastern Partnership countries. EU is assisting individual, member states, EU through multiple instruments. This group of 6 countries: Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, 3 Caucasus republics, very unusual group of countries. And also when the whole project of Eastern Partnership was created, we thought that it will be much easier to help these countries in their transition and dialogue. Here she is. We are displeased, but you are welcome. Miriam Lexman, member of European Parliament. We are very proud of her. She is our very young but very active member of European Parliament, and she will tell us why she came late. You will tell us you had lunch with State Secretary, I expect. Yeah, okay, you don't need to apologize. We take it from you. Okay. So we are starting with this Eastern Partnership. Very often what we are discussing, that strategy towards Eastern Partnership. Is there anything like strategy towards Eastern Partnership after what happened in last couple of years? Or we need to look at individual cases like what was discussed in previous panel, that sometimes unless you take country-specific context, you cannot develop effective strategy. So let's define this first when we are talking about Eastern Partnership, developmental assistance, democracy assistance, civil society support, and so on. Since you served in EU, how would you take it?
Thank you very much. I've been reading again the joint statement of the Eastern Partnership and the summit agreement of last December. And I think many things that are in these key documents for Eastern Partnership are actually rather visionary and very much valid today. We talk about resilience, we talk about strengthening livelihoods, we're talking about peace building, conflict prevention as well. I think that is a little bit overtaken by events, but there are so many elements in it which are of huge importance right now. Of course, when we look at the developments of the past months, we see a significant amount of stress being exerted on these strategies, on these visions that we have there. And many of those elements that maybe sounded very ordinary Brussels speak, things that we find very often, those documents of huge importance right now, but with different urgencies depending on the countries. So in short, I believe the strategic context that we have here is very much valid now and will become even more valid as we see these crises developing even further. What we need to look at now is to emphasize, to look at different strands of action in how far we need to adjust that. For instance, the entire dimension of conflict management, peace building, that of course gets into the forefront as the conflict in Ukraine further develops and changes, maybe comes to, hopefully, to a halt or ends in a certain stalemate. We're not sure about that. In the whole context of this Eastern Partnership, I think Central European countries have a very important role to play due to their geopolitical location, but also due to their size. It is all about a certain proximity to the conflict zones, a certain, let's say, sentiment or conscience of what is going on there. It has also a lot to do with economic influences, like the shock waves of that, and also a lot to do with refugees. And I very much believe that there's a very important role to play for our countries here in the immediate neighborhood in providing practical answers to those challenges within the Eastern Partnership. It's not just Brussels institutions, but it is the EU. It's us, the EU, member states, EU, civil society is the EU. So we have a very important role to play in that.
Miriam, I'm just reframing a bit the same question what I was asking Raimund from European Parliament. You are dealing with multiple issues, but if we would be talking here a year ago, we would be discussing Belarus as something what was keeping our attention out of Eastern Partnership countries. Nowadays, since outbreak of war, everybody is consumed with Russia invasion and rescue operation, help, assistance to Ukraine. Do you, as politician in European Parliament, feel still that focus on Eastern Partnership is on Eastern Partnership, or people are so focused on problematic zones or countries? How do you see this policy making and assistance development towards these countries? Not speaking now to Ukraine only, but to the group of countries.
Thank you very much. A very important question, and especially because of the war, we need to maybe reflect where we have failed and see how to reshape our strategy for the Eastern Partnership, but as well as for our neighborhood, because that also, it concerns also the Western Balkans, but also kind of larger neighborhood. As it was rightly said, the Eastern Partnership priorities are still very important and are still valid even after the big changes in terms of the absolutely inhuman and tragic aggression in Ukraine. What was named is resilient, what was named is human rights, peace building, conflict prevention, economic development. But we didn't see this in a context. We were lacking the context, and the context was enlargement. Unfortunately, the European Parliament was very vocal and was pushing that enlargement is, or at least in terms of rhetorical exercise, that we still admit that if a country fulfills all the criteria, is accepted. And we were unable to say this. The Parliament was, but the member states and the governments were not. And unfortunately, it's very hard to work on the partial aims, as what I listed and what you have also listed, when we don't have the context. And the context was missing. In terms of Western Balkans, we were losing these countries and are losing these countries in terms of their closer relationship with China and Russia, in the Eastern Partnership, unfortunately, Ukraine was still absolutely vividly trying to get closer and closer to the EU, and we were pushing, for reforms. There was, of course, a development, but the context wasn't there. And unfortunately, now we stand again at the very same question. The European Parliament, Central Eastern European member states or Eastern EU member states calling for candidate status, calling for clear stand vis-à-vis Ukraine, and we are unable to do that. And unfortunately, these are the failures, because it's very difficult to continue on the partial aims if we don't put it in the right context. And of course, we are not talking about accepting Ukraine tomorrow. Of course, all the treaties has to be fulfilled, all the criteria have to be fulfilled, but we are unable even to say, yes, if you do your homework, you are welcome. And this is the biggest failure. In the European Parliament, we have already kind of called for innovative ways of integration of the candidates and associated countries. Actually, this was based on mainly the work of Alexander Duleba, a Slovak scholar who is now kind of main advisor to our prime minister and working on the future of steps of the kind of vision for Ukraine and Eastern Partnership, where we were talking about integration of these countries into the working groups and committees of the Council and the Commission, informal Council meetings, because we felt that many of the issues which are dealt at these policy groups, political groups, or the heads of states or ministers and council meetings are very much related to their interests. And in geopolitical, we need to be kind of making a position as Europe often, and we were not including these countries, although many of our decisions had strong impacts on their geopolitical position as well. I mean, vis-à-vis Russia, for sure, now we see the results. So I believe that now, I mean, we really have to do a kind of deep thinking where we have failed and change this approach, that we are missing the context and we are just focusing on small aims which won't work.
Thank you, Miriam. Archila, I'm moving to you. Previous session, and Tanya was raising this issue from my point of view very correctly, that whenever we look at innovation, these are not only small things, how to deliver something, but how are we innovative in societal changes or shifting our way of looking at things. Miriam was just saying that probably we are missing something in assisting Eastern Partnership countries, and this war just showed us completely new dimension that rethinking of our assistance strategy should be done. You live in one of the 6 Eastern Partnership countries. Tell us whether you are missing this innovation in thinking, or where you are seeing some examples from EU which you would like to mention that they are working vis-à-vis Eastern Partnership countries, Georgia included.
I would support the idea that EU has to have a systemic view of this big region, Eastern Partnership, at least because Russia sees so. For Russia, its immediate neighborhood is an object of its interest, as it many times stated, privileged interests, and has been trying to promote those interests in different ways, taking into account the specificities of each of these neighboring countries. I don't mean only Eastern Partnership countries, but also Central Asian countries, the former Soviet neighborhood, apart from Baltics. These 11 former Soviet republics, and only because Russia perceives this neighborhood something very top priority of its aggressive, unfriendly policies, then of course European Parliament should also Europe, including European Parliament and and also executive branch of European supranational institutions. I mean, they have to also perceive this region as a whole, as a neighborhood of Russia, but of course, taking into account the specific features, specific elements, components, and characteristics of each of these countries. And since the inception of the Eastern Partnership, the time that has passed has shown that within this Eastern Partnership, the countries have different understandings of their future relationship with the European Union and also with Russia. These past years have shown that three countries, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, graduated a certain stage of their being part of Eastern Partnership program, and they were long been ready for something qualitatively different. And I would agree that the European Parliament many times been kind of ahead of thinking or at the forefront of European thinking, and in its resolutions and statements, the European Parliament several times stated that these countries should be treated something differently on the basis of the principle of differentiation, then called more for more. And in fact, in our countries, in Georgia, I'm speaking now on behalf of Georgia, there was a feeling of the lack of proper reciprocity on the part of the European Union, because we were undertaking very difficult reforms, costly, politically risky for the governments, against the backdrop of the increasing pressure from Russia in the form of its propaganda. And it was a huge step forward done in 2014 when Georgia, as Moldova and Ukraine were offered to sign the agreement on association. I'm not dipping on what happened with Ukraine, but for Georgia it was a major stimulus, a major carrot. And it further stimulated the pro-Western forces within Georgia, and also reforms were being done with more energy, enthusiasm, and Georgia really did succeed in implementing those reforms. Then the visa-free followed in 2017. Again, another push, and then both in the academia, in policy community, the most popular question was, what next? What should be the next step? Because Eastern Partnership would not imply a membership card. Because Eastern Partnership was a product within the paradigm of the European neighborhood policy, which in itself did not intend to imply membership perspective. It was European neighborhood policy. So we were neighbors, not the prospective members of the Union, but the neighbors. So Eastern Partnership was a product of ENP. So that's why it should not be expected that the Eastern Partnership would allow these three countries to reach this status. But these very unfortunate events in and around Ukraine opened this opportunity, and now a political decision, mostly politically and geopolitically driven decision, was made to provide this perspective, and the questionnaires were given to the three countries. That means that the relationship with these three countries, if they are provided the status of candidate of the membership, more so if they will start this process of negotiations, accession process, then according to the existing EAP, European Eastern Partnership framework, and founding documents, then something has to be changed in those documents because those documents do not imply membership. But if we are in the process of the accession, then how are we going to stay within the Eastern Partnership? So this has to be somehow tackled.
Very good. Evžen, you represent on the panel one of the Central European countries for which Eastern Partnership and assistance to democratic development, civil society development, and helping these countries, those who want to join the EU, to think it through and help them. How do you see assistance of our group of countries, let's say Visegrad plus, to the countries of Eastern Partnership?
Okay, thank you. So yeah, well, I can speak just from the perspective of my organization, Caritas Czech Republic, which is among relatively many development NGOs from this part of Europe who are working in these Eastern Partnership countries. So I can definitely see a certain difference in our work and mainly in our interactions with local counterparts in these countries when I compare it with our work in, for example, Mongolia and even more in Middle East, or not to talk about Africa. Yeah, so the context we are working in is definitely different in, I would say, in kind of positive way. And here we are probably coming to one of the topics or subtopics of this panel, whether there is anything specific Central Eastern European countries can bring to the assistance or to development assistance in the Eastern Partnership countries. Yeah, so considering the similarities in history, similar historical experience, very similar experience in terms of socialist past, and similarities in terms of our current perspective or understanding of Russia's role in Europe, and especially in this part of Europe. Yeah, there is something common we can build on, and my impression is, and that's based on several years of experience of working there, is that we do have something to offer in terms of mainly experience in transition procedure, and we are, I would say, a bit better received or perceived when we come from outside with something, with some solutions. Yeah.
Yeah. Miriam, you are in European Parliament, but you have wealth of experience working with civil society groups in the region when you were working for IRI, but you worked in Slovak NGO community. Is this based on what we are seeing now, assisting countries of Eastern Partnership, particularly the three, which Archie was also mentioning? Do we have some comparative advantage, countries of Central Europe, which join European Union, in assisting these countries? And if so, could you give some examples?
Yes, we definitely do have the comparative advantage, but maybe in a various way, in different times we use it as Central Eastern European countries. I mean, we sometimes see shining one country, others are lagging behind, and it's changing. The comparative advantage is definitely the experience of a totalitarian regime, as well as experience of the integration process to the European Union. This gives us maybe more understanding on what's going on on the ground, as well as kind of a greater understanding in what way we need to assist these countries in order to continue with the reforms and continue with the integration. On the other hand, the maybe disadvantage is financing, but here I would say that we consider us still being the poor part of the EU, where we don't need to, and I think this is maybe where we are lagging behind, that we are lagging behind in our promises, how much we are actually going to give to the development aid, which is not very moral because we pledged certain numbers. But also we do not see that if we will invest more and if we will bring this experience to our citizens through education, through informal work with NGOs and civil society, with citizens, that our countries will be profiting and will be more resilient to different disinformation and the kind of hybrid threats we are facing, and also the kind of populist, far left, far right parties using fear of the foreign, fear of something unknown among our citizens in order to play with the moods in the population and their political views. So I would say that we do have advantages, but we are not using them to the full extent, and we are also not using the advantage we have in order to help our own countries. And maybe a final point, and I think we need to be far more better there and really try to do most. And final point is that maybe, I mean, in Slovakia we have one NGO which I would say, or two maybe, the Catholic charity as well as ERCO, which are sort of in terms of funding more independent from the government because they have their own resources, they do their own collection of money. And that makes them more strategic because the changes in the government and the changes of the priorities of the ministry doesn't have such an immediate impact on that they will have to change their focus from one year to another, which again is maybe something which we need to see more strategic, which countries are our priority, and maybe try to invest more rather than making changes too often, because then we see that these organizations who are not 100% dependent from the governmental funding, which unfortunately our development organization mostly are, makes them more efficient in their work. And the final point is private sector. I really welcome that we do involve and include private sector more and more. Obviously, we don't have, even though we do have rich companies in Central Eastern Europe already, but what I like is the innovation, because this is the future kind of business, and to bring innovation into development, to join these two efforts, I think this is something which we need to look into more, because there is a potential in Central Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. Raimund, Austria signed new partnership agreement with Georgia and Moldova. Are there some specificities in Austrian approach in this assistance strategy which you would like to highlight, or probably also whether you cooperate with some of the countries of Central Eastern Europe in achieving your goals?
Yeah, first of all, maybe to what you just said, I believe there is a huge potential for closer collaboration between Central European countries. I already mentioned geopolitical location, similar outlook. When I was working abroad for the European Union, there was a fantastic cooperation going on between our countries. We were always dubbed the Knedel Alliance because of similar culinary preferences, maybe. But my point is there was something, in particular in times of crisis, COVID-related evacuations, where we just saw that there is a natural affinity and we just work extremely well together in times of crisis. Now, as far a more systemic collaboration, I think there is a lot of room for further improvement, I would say. We do have some formats where we cooperate with each other. It's the Slavkov format, for instance. The last meeting took place in April last year, where we discussed a number of issues of common interest, for instance, COVID-19 and responses thereto, in particular for economic recovery. How do we cooperate regarding humanitarian assistance? making mutual use of transport means, of a number of things. So very, very important tools. But we also talked about, for instance, certain methodology. How do we define strategy and how do we deliver our development cooperation through this, what is usually dubbed as whole of government approach, meaning really taking everyone on board, in particular civil society. I think this whole of government approach is something very, very important, because we see now in times of crisis how resilient actually our relief efforts have been, thanks to our cooperation with civil society. Without civil society and the really hugely impressive responses that they were able to mobilize on the ground in Moldova, everywhere, in Austria, Czech Republic, in Slovakia, I don't think in Poland, I don't think we would be in the position that we are now. So the way that we have been now defining our strategy with really making much stronger emphasis on our cooperation with civil society, bringing them on board in the conceptualization stage, but also the way how we deliver aid. This has been for us, I think, something that we've been doing beforehand, but we are doing much more now. And in times of crisis, it proved to be a decisive factor for success. And I'm sure this is also something which is going to play a much bigger role even in the future.
Evžen, Slavkov format or Austerlitz format cooperation between Czech Republic, Austria and Slovakia was mentioned. Czech Republic will assume EU presidency as of July, and Slovakia will have presidency within this Slavkov plus within Visegrad format. Do you see, after this outbreak of war, difference of attitudes of Czech government or probably other governments in your work, trying to bring you more on board and utilize you as NGO, because it went through whole day that recognition of volunteerism, recognition of civic engagement and public-private partnership in time of crisis is of critical importance. Do you see some shifts, or you are still nervous that there is not enough cooperation?
Yeah, thank you. No, I'm not nervous, because I got used to various approaches of the state. But I can see certain positive shift, but it's it's a bit unclear whether it's related to the outbreak of the war only, or whether it has also something to do with the change in our government several months ago, which I think is also the case. Yeah.
But we welcome the change in Slovakia, if I may.
Me too.
Okay.
I think everyone does. Well, not everyone,
Okay, but we don't need to go that way.
Okay, so yeah, one practical example, the Czech government or Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they allocated relatively big portion of funds for humanitarian assistance. In the first week after the war started, and then a bit later they opened again relatively big, considering the size of the Czech humanitarian assistance, relatively big call for proposals to react to Ukraine crisis. They allocated 50 million Czech crowns, which is, compared to usual size of humanitarian calls for proposals, it's relatively a lot, and maybe there will be some further allocations. So yeah, and this call was opened for Czech NGOs, and there was even some kind of consultation process preceding the launch of the call, where we were invited to share our experience or update them about what we were doing in Ukraine, what kind of assistance we deliver, what kind of approaches we would propose. And I would say that to some extent they did take our reflections into account. So yeah, I see such a shift.
Before I will give the floor to Archil, Georgia is part of your territory where you are assisting? I mean, you personally within division of the labor, is it difficult to help Georgia?
If I simplify a bit, not. I would say that well, our Georgian program is or has been very well running for 5, 6, maybe even more last years, and that's mainly it has something to do with the proximity we have been talking about, and that's also thanks to the position or approach of our counterparts in Georgia, be it civil society, and also when it comes to public institutions, ministries. One example, we have been cooperating for 5 years, 6, with Georgian Ministry of Healthcare under several projects. We have been working with them on I would call it a very much systemic level to improve, for example, quality management of in primary healthcare, or developing services for people with autism spectrum disorder. And yet the reflection or the feedback or the cooperation we are receiving from their side is very good, and we really strongly appreciate it. Yeah, it makes our work much easier.
Good to hear. Archil, your country was praised. He was unprepared for that question, so it was genuine answer. But you mentioned that you are in between Russia, who considers that you are a neighbor, and we Europeans are considering you also as a neighbor. So you have rather tough neighborhood from east, and the neighbor, which, according to what Miriam was also mentioning, nowadays need to define how country-specific versus regional strategy we are going to develop. From the position of Georgia, what would you advise to EU policy makers, Central East Europeans included? What in this existential period we need to focus on the most?
In 2008, when Russia invaded Georgia, it pursued multiple purposes. And one of the purposes was to wound Georgia in terms of occupying its territories and make it ineligible for membership accession to NATO and critical rapprochement with European Union. It succeeded in that. But what Russia did not attain as a goal was that Russia did not and could not change or force Georgia to change its foreign policy orientation. Because this foreign policy orientation of Georgia's, this Western-leaning policy was formed already back in the 90s in the wake of breakup of the Soviet Union and the Russian-backed separatist wars and economic blockade on the part of Russia. So it was already mid-90s when Georgian elite, first and foremost, understood that the guarantees of the welfare and security should be sought in the West, not in Russia. And since then, Georgia's this pro-Western orientation has been supported by a population with very high numbers, sometimes reaching 80% or even more. For example, today, after this opportunity of getting status of candidacy in the European Union, the support for European integration in Georgia is 88%, record high. And what I'm trying to say is that Georgia's pro-Westernism, this pro-Western orientation, has always been founded on a very solid foundation. And every successive government, would take this into account, and every successive government, or in every elections, the competitive political forces should have taken into account in order to get more votes. What are the sentiments and aspirations of the public? And that gives me a hope that it would be really not only difficult but even unimaginable that someday Georgia changes its orientation unless it's dismembered by brutal force. I don't know. Yeah. Otherwise, it will not happen. And any doubts about different Georgian governments that maybe now it's kind of a diverting from this. These are only just very temporary and false signs. What in fact is happening there. And now you mentioned that how Georgia feels kind of a sandwich between Russia and Europe. So of course we cannot change geography, and we will always be neighboring Russia as long as Russia stays as a unified state in its current borders, as long as. And we have to have good relations, but of course not at the expense of our territorial integrity or our foreign policy choices. It kind of requires from us to strike a very delicate balance and to be very careful, especially against the backdrop of our experience of 2008. Georgia already shed its share of blood in fighting Russia, starting from, by the way, late 80s. It was still Soviet Union when in 1989 there was a mass protests in Tbilisi demanding independence from Soviet Union. And the Soviet troops, they cracked down on these 50,000 people on the Rustaveli Avenue with 21 casualties, and very many hundreds were poisoned. And so since then, Georgia seeks rational distancing from Russia, of course, without changing geography. So you have to, because of the geography, you have to trade, you have to. Georgia is the only South Caucasian country who has open borders for the citizens of all neighbor countries. Mm-hmm. None of the countries in the region is absolutely open. Even Russian citizens with Russia, with whom we do not have diplomatic relations, we do not require them to take Georgian visas. They come in with visa-free. This is part of this balancing, but at the same time, we of course try to get every next steps to get closer institutionally with the West, but also value-based to build Europe in Georgia. Yeah. Because Georgia's integration into this institution is not buying ticket and flying to Paris or Brussels. It's about building Europe in Georgia. And this is a major task, aspiration for all Georgians. But when it comes to the politics, then we are a Caucasian nation, possibly one of the most emotional nations on earth. And sometimes we quarrel, sometimes we fight each other. And currently, in the last past 2 years, this political polarization has become very fierce and making hostage many other very important areas, including reforms and also some social economic problems, conflict-related issues. So these are just stalled because so much energy and time is being consumed by this infighting. Yeah. Many things are being left behind.
Yeah, now we have 15 minutes, and now I would like to ask any of you to either make comments or ask questions of any panelists on the topics what we have been discussing so far. Please go ahead. Just introduce yourself and ask your question. Yeah, mic is coming.
Hello, my name is Jan Liska. I'm from the Czech Republic. I would have a question for Mr. Magis from the Austrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs concerning a subject that he touched upon already. The question is following, you know, when you design the program and the priorities that you're going to find in these Eastern Neighborhood partnership countries, how much the non-governmental organizations that are operating in these countries are part of the needs analysis, and how much their point of view is taken into consideration by the ministry, by the government? Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I may answer it, first of all, we have two kind of strategies. We have our general strategy for the Austrian Development Corporation, which is really taking on board on all institutions. And that's a very intensive, sometimes also painful coordination and consultation process where we have very, very extensive consultations with civil society. In that program, we define our priority areas, priority topics, principles, but also a broad set of action. On a lower level, or building in that, on the framework of that, we have these regional or country strategies. And there again, we have a very intensive consultation process with civil society. And I think this has been also developing over the years up to the realization with the current program that we have, which started this year actually, it's lasting until 24, that civil society plays a huge role, not only in carrying out a system, but also in the conceptualization. So a short answer to your question, we have a number of strategy development processes where civil society in Austria, but also the recipient countries, are being consulted, their views are being incorporated, and then of course they are also part of the process of delivery of aid, and then also they play a role in feedback. So my role is, I'm the director of the Department for Strategy and Evaluation. So I do strategy development, and then again, in evaluating what we did, the effectiveness of our aid, again, civil society plays a huge role as a partner in these evaluations as well.
Okay, any further question? Please go ahead.
Yeah, maybe a bit generic question about the Eastern neighborhood. Several of you talked a bit in general about the Eastern neighborhood. And my experience working in the Eastern neighborhood is that it's almost not possible to have a regional approach to this because the countries are so different. Can you maybe elaborate a bit on this? How do you deal with the differences between the countries in the Eastern neighborhood?
Yeah, I fully share your feeling. Let's start from you. You are Eastern Partnership citizen.
Yes, there has to be a regional approach, which does not include individual some aspects and some individual approaches to the countries, given the countries, locational specificities of cultural or reform-related status or whatever. But again, the region has to remain in the focus of Europe. Even in case when these three countries succeed so much that we will be ready for exceeding the European Union, does not remember that Europe should forget about Belarus or Armenia or Azerbaijan.
Archie, but I don't think that question was forgetting, not forgetting, but this dilemma, are we still dealing with the region or distinct entities for which we need to design specific approaches?
In terms of if you take into account that all of these countries are neighbors of Russia, then of course we are dealing with one region, neighborhood of Russia. And if the global task, global objective of ours is to deal with Russia, because the end of the Cold War did not solve the issue of Russia historically. Yeah. So once and for all, this Russia's issue has to be solved. Because even if war is over in Ukraine, does not mean that the the future threats will disappear. So we have to deal with Russia as a huge challenge, and since we are dealing with Russia historically in the long term, then we also have to have in mind the happenings and developments in the neighborhood, and using whatever the dynamics in this neighborhood and identifying some advantages or some additional resources for the free world to effectively deal with Russia, to get Russia transformed in a way that it ceases being a threat for peace and world order. So in that sense, we are dealing with a region. But given the local differences in this region, then of course we have to apply maybe in a smarter way this stick and carrot or more for more policies. And as I said, this provision of the status of the candidate, I think this has to be a definite decision, because in Georgia, I think this is the case in Moldova and of course in Ukraine, that we have long deserved the status of candidate. Yeah. Why? Because according to the Article 49 of the Lisbon Treaty, any European country which complies the so-called Copenhagen criteria may become member of the European Union. So not given the membership prospect means that you are not considering this country as Europeans. We are not claiming that we are complying with the Copenhagen criteria or will someday definitely comply. No, but we are Europeans, so we have to have theoretically a prospect of membership, and unfortunately neither European neighborhood policy nor Eastern Partnership would provide this prospect. Yeah. So now this when Ukrainians are shedding their blood to confirm or to persuade everybody there they deserve this, I mean, status, of course this should be provided. Yeah. But the question is whether conditionally or unconditionally the further process of negotiations, accession talks should also be provided. This could be debatable, but the fact of providing status of candidate is something which is should not be divided. And one final point is that the European thinking and Euro-Atlantic thinking has been that the provision of membership action plan and NATO membership, this is something parts of one whole. The same applies to European membership. This status of candidate and the final membership is considered to be one whole. One needs to, I mean, detach these two, because the status of candidate should not mean that necessarily the country will become a European member, yeah. Or if country has a membership action plan, that country will necessarily will become member of the NATO. Unfortunately, this attitude has been holding back the provision of membership action plan to Georgia and Ukraine, and so far it was holding back this provision of the membership prospect in European Union, because the thinking was this: then I'm providing status of candidate if I decided for myself that that particular country or region will necessarily become a member of my union. This is something which I don't understand why it is so.
Miriam, your position on the question raised.
I would agree with what was already said, that practically there is a common denominator. I mean, it's the proximity to Russia, which kind of unites the countries of the Eastern Partnership and their kind of former being part of the Soviet Union, so this common history. On the other hand, I mean, we have to have a specific policies for the specific developments in the country at the moment, because yes, there are differences which are kind of general differences, but there are also changes which kind of require changes in our policies. And I would say, I mean, the biggest change we have seen now in Ukraine, and I'm not sure if the ODA programs of the EU were ready for the fact that we are working with a country which is one of the kind of champions of the Eastern Partnership in terms of reforms for the democracy. and turning into war country where we need a very different approach. So I guess that the flexibility and to kind of ability to quickly respond to the changes, because that also comes with the change of government in some of these countries where we need to have a different approach, or the human rights issues going up and down. I mean, I remember 6 years ago, we were lifting all the sanctions towards Belarus and Lukashenko and his proxies, believing that this country is heading the right direction. And a couple of years later, we had one of the biggest, like crackdown on the civil society, on the population, human rights breaches. So, I mean, really being similar to countries which have a huge, horrible human rights record before. So, I mean, and some of the changes we could have been prepared, some of the mistakes we didn't need to do. And I mean, I would say very concrete things now in Ukraine. I mean, we really have to be flexible because we are working in a conditions as in a war country, which probably no one has an experience, but the quickest we will change and being able to provide our ODA, the quicker we will be able to maybe see results, or at least, I mean, provide help which is necessary. And that kind of means flexibility. That means also flexibility in maybe trusting more the partners in order that the money are spent correctly without bringing bill for every, I don't know, chocolate bought to a child on a street crying because whatever the horrible situation and tragedy they are going through. So I would say flexibility and foresight, because sometimes we could have seen something coming in these countries and we are unable to prepare ourselves and the aid in advance, which I think we are failing again and again, and that needs to be changed.
Raimund, Russia is apparently unifying factor for still keeping Eastern Partnership, or is there something else?
Well, I would sincerely hope that Russia is not the only motivation for us to embrace European values, but there is a value in it itself to strive for human rights, gender equality and environmental standards, and the long list of things, the 20 priorities that we have in the Eastern Partnership. It's not that I'm married to the Eastern Partnership strategic communication, things like that. The discussion that you mentioned about what do we want in Eastern Europe is a very important one, and we certainly need to upend our game a little bit. It is not enough to talk about instruments. We need to, in a fast-changing geopolitical setting, we need to think, what do we want? What can we achieve with the means and the tools that we have? And what risks are we prepared to take? And I think we are a little bit, I feel, all the converted, we all believe in, that we need to give a proper answer to Eastern Partnership countries. But I also hear the voices of other countries say, like, look, before we engage in this big geopolitical game, we need to be sure that we are able actually to succeed with these questions, that we are able to deliver on the promises that we are going to make. If we are not, we need to change things here. I find a certain, let's say, logic in that and sentiment, stressing at the same time that Austria has always been a strong advocate for countries in Southeastern Europe actually to join the European Union, and they are also like a strong voice in advancing the dialogue on Eastern Partnership, what it should mean. But it is certainly important that we accelerate our discussion on the European Union. How do we deliver certain things, and how we deliver on promises that we're going to make? Just to say things and then end up with even bigger problems is certainly not the solution, because it might very much open questions on the survivability of our union if we do things that we are not prepared to bring to a logical end. I hope I'm not too cryptic with that, but I'm just saying there are risks involved. Now, in this game, again, I think Central European countries have a very, very important role to play as advocates, as active partners, not only within the European Union, but also through a number of other formats, OSCE, United Nations, where we have to work together in order to, advance the discussion, for instance, on peace building, conflict prevention, on practical delivery of assistance, very, very important. Also, food security, for instance, transport linkage, and so on. We have a very important role to play there. But also there, with a certain self-criticism, we need to ask in how far actually we walk the talk, in how far actually we can do better in order to deliver on the needs of the hour. And lastly, said, but because that sounds always a little bit too negative, I want to stress the potential that we have here. And also, I want to stress that the reason also why we are meeting here, I guess, is how we can forge better this partnership with civil society and governments. And I think this is a huge asset that we have here. It's not just like a term or a slogan or something like that, but there's a lot behind it. Practical cooperation, people-to-people contacts. There's so many, this is like a network, this is like a solid foundation that we have for our collaboration, in particular with Eastern Partnership countries, of huge importance. And this is one of the biggest assets that we actually have to bring to the table.
Thank you, Evžen. I will reframe. You are the last one, and we are closing the session, and it will be also the end of number 3 session. We need to sort of do a little spiritual twist. You are from Caritas. I hope you know what Pope Francis thinks about Ukraine, and Pope Francis is challenging Moscow Patriarch Kirill. I am following their debate with great interest, and I hope you follow it as well. Do you think that religion and religious leaders do have some role to play in reconciliation and changes what we are thinking about in this group of countries where both Russians think that this is their neighborhood, we think it's our neighborhood, we want to give them free space, Russians want to control that. Is Pope Francis doing good job while talking to Patriarch of Moscow, Kirill?
Thank you for this question.
You are welcome.
Well, this will be much easier to say once we see some results, if we see any in the end, which is very much unclear. I do not much about Patriarch Kirill, but I would express certain dose of skepticism in this regard, knowing about, taking into account his probably close ties to the regime and to the President Putin in particular. At the same time, it probably should be one of the roles of religious leaders to maintain some dialogue, even in such circumstances. Probably there should be some red line they should not cross, but probably it is still kind of relevant and acceptable. So and as long as religions will exist in terms of having some people that follow them, they will retain some influence over the people. So it may still play some role, but really difficult to say more now. We will see where it will lead and what will it bring, if anything.
Well, you see Caritas person who is rather doubtful, even among Vatican's role. So in that case, I don't think that we need to be so worried that we do not know everything. Because
I am sorry, I am simply a rather
but
skeptical, pragmatic person. So I do express my doubts rather frankly. So, but yeah.
And that is why we like you. Okay, we
Thank
like
you.
Evžen, we like Raimund. Thank you very much, Madam Miriam Lexman.
You don't like me.
We like you in the end. And thank you, Archil. And thank you all for being so attentive, audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.